Hello, my friends. Russia has stated it 100 times. It does not want a war with Europe. The Kremlin's position has always been that conflict with Europe benefits nobody. But Vladimir Putin has made one thing equally clear. If European leaders suddenly decide they want a war and they fire the first shots, Russia is ready right now. And there will be absolutely no doubt about the outcome. The speed and severity with which Europe would destroy itself in such a scenario is something European politicians should contemplate very carefully, because this wouldn't be Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia has been acting surgically, cautiously, methodically. It is not total war. It is not even a war in the modern sense. It is a controlled military operation. But a war with Europe would be a completely different beast, and Europe would be the 1E. Putin said this plainly, with a clarity that Western media pretends not to understand. If a full-scale conflict erupts, Russia may soon find it has no one left in Europe to negotiate with. That is not bravado. It is simple arithmetic of my. But that wasn't even the most consequential part of the day. Last night, Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, held a 5-hour meeting with Putin. 5 hours. And absolutely nothing changed. No breakthroughs. No compromises. No movement. The meeting ended exactly as it began, because Russia isn't interested in vague American promises or ambiguous diplomatic poetry. Moscow wants precise, enforceable terms, and Washington wants wiggle room for future provocative. Meanwhile, the EU continues its favorite pastime, geopolitical comedy. Ursula von der Leyen is set to present a legal mechanism, a magic trick, to steal frozen Russian assets from Euroclear and funnel them into the black hole formerly known as Ukraine. The EU believes that if they slap the word legal onto a robbery, investors around the world won't notice. They imagine that seizing the sovereign funds of a nuclear superpower will somehow make Europe look strong and trustworthy. In reality, global investors are watching this circus closely, and they are already calculating where to move their money. Spoiler, not Europe. Let's turn briefly to Ukraine. Pravda, that shining lighthouse of truth and responsible journalism, loudly announcing that Putin complained the Europeans were excluded from peace talks. But they conveniently omit the part where Putin explains that Europe excluded itself. Russia maintained open diplomatic channels. Europe slammed the door shut. Viktor Orban didn't cut communications. Robert Fico didn't cut communications. The EU establishment alone decided that talking to Russia was beneath them because they believed, foolishly, that Russia would collapse within months. Now they sit outside the negotiating room, pounding on the door with a bruised ego. Why did Europe disengage? Because they convinced themselves they would inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They believed sanctions would devastate the Russian economy and Western-trained Ukrainian troops would crush the Russian army. They replaced reality with propaganda and called it strategy. Today, Russia's economy still functions, Russian industry is retooled, and Russia's military has expanded in strength and capability. The sanctions failed. The Ukrainian army has been ground down. The fantasy collapsed. And now Europe is left holding nothing but its own delusions. The result? Europe has no meaningful communication channels with Moscow. None. And now they enter panic mode, desperately hoping that Donald Trump can negotiate better terms for them. They still haven't understood that Trump cannot give them anything Russia does not agree to first. If Europe wants influence in the final settlement, it must swallow its pride and speak to the man who controls the battlefield, Vladimir Putin. Trump, meanwhile, has his own problems. He needs a win. He needs a way to exit this conflict with dignity and a headline he can wave in front of cameras. He needs to point at a piece of territory or a concession and say, look, I delivered peace. He's not fighting for Europe's reputation. He's fighting for his own political survival. That means you. Tensions will only escalate from here. There is only room for one victor narrative on the losing side of a war. And Washington will not let Brussels take it. Yuri Ushakov confirmed precisely this. No compromise has been found. No Putin-Trump meeting is planned. Some U.S. ideas were more or less acceptable, but the wording is unacceptable. Why? because Americans are vague, Russians are not. The U.S. sent what was supposed to be a 28-point peace plan, but it somehow arrived as 27 points in Moscow. What happened to point 28? Did someone forget to attach the page? Did Europe scribble on it? Did Zelensky eat it? Nobody knows, because Moscow refuses to comment, likely out of politeness to avoid embarrassing someone. 4 additional documents arrived as well, likely European and Ukrainian revisions, and Moscow rejected them all. Why? Because Russia will not agree to anything unclear or reversible, especially not on the territorial question. That is the core issue. Putin will not relinquish territory gained at immense military cost. And Trump cannot leave without a victory souvenir to show the press. Their interests collide head on. And here lies the truth. Putin's tone has changed. He has dropped diplomatic niceties. No more polite references to partners. He spoke directly. Russia will not compromise on core national interests. If negotiations fail, escalation follows. Europe needs to understand this urgently, but instead of facing reality, Europe chooses fantasy. The EU is preparing to steal Russian assets as if global markets will applaud. They imagine that investors will cheer the day. Contracts mean nothing. They tell themselves anything is possible in Europe. Yes, including the total destruction of what little credibility Europe still has. NATO, meanwhile, demands a seat at the table in negotiations where it currently holds no leverage whatsoever. They draw red lines, but have no one to communicate them to. They insist Ukraine's future must be shaped by NATO's decisions alone, while ignoring the only actor with the actual power to decide anything, Russia. They discuss Russia's borders with partners, not with Russia. This is like arranging a wedding without inviting either member of the couple, not confusion, but delusion. Then Europe announces it will phase out Russian gas by 2027. Wonderful. And replace it with what exactly? Fairy dust? Unicorn windmills? Europe's entire industrial competitiveness for decades relied on cheap, steady Russian energy. Replace that with expensive American LNG, and you replace prosperity with permanent economic decline. Not a single European leader will speak honestly about this. They simply announce the end of affordable gas like a bartender declaring the bar is closing without realizing the customers are about to burn the place down. And so the West marches forward, blindfolded toward the edge of a cliff. Europe isolated itself diplomatically, destroyed its economic foundations, and staked its future on a war it cannot win. The United States is trying to exit without humiliation. NATO is demanding relevance while losing control. The EU is gambling its entire financial reputation on asset theft. And all the while, Russia expands influence, strengthens alliances, hardens its economy, and dictates the terms of reality because power ultimately belongs to those who can sustain it. The war in Ukraine should have been the moment Europe rediscovered strategic maturity. Instead, it exposed a ruling class obsessed with moral theatrics, allergic to realism, and incapable of admitting error even when the consequences threaten their very existence. Russia didn't isolate Europe. Europe isolated itself. Russia didn't destroy Europe's energy security. Europe destroyed it willingly. Russia didn't undermine Western credibility. Europe and Washington did that all on their own. Now, having dug a hole deep enough to bury its own future, Europe looks up from the bottom and accuses the shovel. Russia stands firm. Europe trembles. The United States hesitates. And history, calm, patient, ruthless, takes note of who understood the moment and who drowned in their illusions. For the last 4 years, European leaders have clung to the same pattern: blame someone else for every misfortune. First, it was Vladimir Putin, naturally. Then, it was Donald Trump. Then suddenly, Steve Witkoff, or even Bard. And now, the newest villain, Viktor Orban. Brussels insists the EU plan was flawless, magnificent, visionary, if only the world stopped interfering. Their mindset is simple. Our plan is perfect. Reality just refuses to cooperate. But reality has a cruel way of arriving at the doorstep, especially now when the conflict in Ukraine is entering its final stage. The moment lies overpower the propaganda, And there are plenty in Europe who still refuse to face the music. And this leads us to the real disease at the core of Western politics: total lack of accountability. Just look at Zelensky. He speaks with Macron about peace that must become truly durable, and he insists the achievement of peace depends on every world leader. Really? Silly us for assuming the leader of Ukraine should hold primary responsibility for Ukraine. The Western narrative loves this "we are all equally responsible" trick. If everyone is responsible, nobody is. It's like those terrible Hollywood movies claiming to be for everyone, always guaranteed to flop. But to be clear, this mindset is Western elite ideology. In Eastern cultures, including Russia, accountability exists. When someone fails, they face the consequences. Not in Brussels. Their self-criticism does not exist unless forced. Which brings us to the EU's frozen Russian asset scheme. European governments accuse Belgium of making excessive demands simply because Belgium wants legal protection before sending 140 billion in Russian funds to Ukraine. Belgium understands perfectly. If Russia sues the EU and wins, who pays? Belgium. So Bard asks the logical question: if we're all responsible, why won't you guarantee the financial fallout? And every EU capital suddenly sprints for the exit. Unity evaporates the moment accountability includes real consequences. Then they claim the scheme is legally safe. If so, why not put money where their mouths are? Why panic when Belgium requests guarantees? Because they know their legal position is a fantasy. They know Moscow has the stronger case. They know this theft will cost them dearly. And so they admit the backup plan: more EU debt, more taxpayer money, more financial burden on the European public, all for a war that Europe pushed, prolonged, and is now losing. Next, the West finally opens the door to Russia's core demand: Ukraine will never join NATO. They now explore creative approaches to bar Ukraine from NATO without admitting that expanding NATO caused the entire conflict. Russia asked for a written guarantee for decades. The West refused, mocked, dismissed. Now they sneak toward admitting the truth, but wrapped in diplomatic cosmetics, so no one in Brussels must utter the forbidden words, "We were wrong." Reuters gives the real Western fear. Trump wants to end the war, but his peace would not punish Russia. Let that sink in. They are terrified. Peace could leave Russia strong. But here is the new global reality. Washington and Moscow are the only powers that matter militarily. NATO is nothing without the United States. A coalition of the willing in Europe would be tiny, symbolic, and still useless without U.S. support. That is not hard power. That is theater. Europe wants to pretend it is a great power. Yet it has no hard power and only imaginary soft power. Nobody outside the West buys the EU's moral grandstanding. In Africa, Asia, Latin America, Russia commands respect. The EU commands eye-rolling. Europe's last leverage? Its market. But instead of using that wisely, Europe let Washington dictate everything. They picked a fight with Moscow while depending on Moscow for energy. They sabotaged their relationship with China while depending on China for industry. Then they brag that they defend European security with whose strength? Whose soldiers? Whose nuclear arsenal? Certainly not their own. Trump summarized it perfectly. You don't have the cards, and when you don't have the cards, you don't get a seat at the negotiating table, which leads to the unavoidable conclusion. Russia and the United States will strike the deal that ends this war. They are the nuclear superpowers. They decide the future. And Europe will be handed the results whether they like it or not. Europe wanted to humiliate Russia. Instead, Europe humiliated itself. They wanted to destroy the Russian economy. Russia's economy grew stronger. They wanted to expand NATO to Ukraine. Now they will swallow the exact opposite on Russia's terms, because the truth is no longer deniable. Russia has already won. Ukraine is collapsing. Europe stands powerless. And in this final stage of the conflict, the Western elite can no longer outrun the consequences of their own lies. The era of denial is ending. The era of accountability long avoided is arriving. That's the reality. And reality always wins. Russia's strategic victory in Ukraine is not a prediction anymore. It is a fact. It's quietly acknowledged in every serious defense ministry on the planet. From the very beginning, Moscow understood that this was not a war for territory, but a war for the future, security architecture of Eastern Europe. And in that objective, Russia has already succeeded completely. The Western media told the world that Russia wanted to seize Kyiv, overthrow the government, and occupy all of Ukraine. Nonsense. Moscow's actual goals were crystal clear and publicly stated: prevent NATO expansion into Ukraine, protect the people of Donbass, and demilitarize Ukraine so it could not be used as a proxy against Russia. Today, NATO membership for Ukraine is dead. Even Washington and Brussels now explore creative ways to admit that reality without losing face, essentially giving Russia exactly what it demanded before the war began. Meanwhile, Russia now holds a fortified land corridor to Crimea that Ukraine will never retake, and Russian control over Donetsk and Lugansk has become permanent. These regions are not just territory, they represent the political heart of the conflict and the symbol of Moscow's refusal to abandon those who speak its language and share its culture. Those people are home now, and they will not be handed back. Militarily, Russia dismantled the second largest army in Europe, the one NATO spent 8 years arming and training to fight precisely this war. Ukraine has burned through multiple generations of its manpower. The professional army of 2022 is gone. The mobilized force of 2023 is gone. And today's fighters are middle-aged civilians pushed into trenches to preserve a doomed front line. The legendary Ukrainian counteroffensive, which Western leaders promised would collapse Russian defenses, collapsed instead into fields of ruined armor supplied by NATO Leopard tanks, Bradley IFVs, Strykers, Challengers, all reduced to scrap metal in Zaporizhia. Russia learned, adapted, and accelerated. Western strategists treated the conflict like a video game, where they could simply add more weapons and expect victory by default. Russia treated it like a real war, a war of logistics, production, and national will. And that is why Russia now produces more artillery shells than the United States and Europe combined, more drones each month than Ukraine receives in an entire season, and has achieved something the West never expected. A wartime economy that is both expanding and innovating faster than NATO's. While Europe emptied its arsenals, Russia increased its stockpiles. While NATO factories debated budgets and bureaucracy, Russia's defense sector ran 24 hours a day. While Ukraine begged for more weapons, Russia built more weapons than Ukraine could ever receive. The myth of Western military superiority, the belief that NATO could simply overwhelm any opponent with technology and money, has been shattered on the fortified lines of the Donbass. The most powerful message from the battlefield is this: Russia has not even mobilized its true strength yet. It has been fighting with a fraction of its capacity, and still the outcome is already decided. Ukraine is out of soldiers. Europe is out of ammunition. The United States is out of patience. Russia, however, is nowhere near out of anything. This is why the tone in Western capitals has shifted from triumphant predictions of a Ukrainian victory to anxious discussions about managing defeat and negotiating responsibly. NATO's smartest analysts are no longer asking if Ukraine will lose. They are asking how much more Ukraine will lose before the collapse becomes undeniable. And in the end, it will become undeniable. Russia achieved its military objectives. Russia dictated the pace of the war. Russia survived every sanction and every escalation. And Russia will control the terms of peace. The battlefield has already spoken. And it speaks Russian.